Have you ever kept a family secret for decades? I won't ask what, just curious.
My phone lit up on a Tuesday afternoon with my brother's name, and because I still had that reflex where I answer family calls even when my stomach tightens, I picked up and said hello in a voice that tried to sound normal. And he did not waste a second before launching into this clipped little speech about Easter dinner being for winners only this year, which he said like a joke but not a joke. Like he wanted the sting to land and the conversation to keep moving as if nothing sharp had been tossed at my face, and in that stretched out beat where I could have argued or laughed or begged for context, I just let the silence sit there and do the work of exposing how much he enjoyed saying it. He kept talking in that chirpy way people do when they think they are above the mess they just made, saying Mom wanted a smaller group and that he and his wife were hosting and it would keep the vibe tight and maybe I could swing by later in the week. And every word sounded like a hand patting my head and steering me away, and I understood, with this calm that almost annoyed me by how steady it was, that I was being pushed out of a room I had helped build, a room I had cleaned after holidays when everyone else disappeared to nap or watch sports, a room where I had paid the caterer when Dad was sick and the account was tangled and Mark said he would Venmo later, and then never did because later, for him, always showed up with empty pockets. I said, okay, and I said it the way you speak to a cashier who miscounts your change and then corrects it themselves, polite but not invested, and he started filling the space with explanations I hadn't asked for. The kind of filler that tries to paint cruelty as logistics, and I gave him nothing back because I finally understood that he heard my pushback as static and my compliance as proof of his ranking, and I was done supplying his scoreboard with any more data. I hung up and sat there with that dull, old heat climbing up my neck, and I told myself I would not do the usual tour through past scenes where he took little chunks out of me in front of people and smiled while doing it. Except the memories do not ask permission to replay, and there they were. The baby shower where he joked that I never finish anything. The Thanksgiving where he announced I am book smart and life stupid. The Christmas where he gave me a budgeting book because I had chosen a smaller apartment and he called it downsizing your ambition, and everyone chuckled because he is funny when you are not the punchline, and time after time I told myself he is stressed or insecure or trying to make our parents laugh, which is a charitable reading that lets you be a doormat while feeling like a saint. Here is what I did not say to him on that call, because explaining myself to someone who wants me small is a hobby I quit when Dad got sick and was trying to keep the family from turning into a lawsuit. He set up a trust for the grandkids' education and named me as co-trustee with broad discretion to pause, redirect, or terminate distributions if the money created dependency, misbehavior, or conflict. And I took that role seriously in a way that felt like love extended past the funeral. And while Mark treated it like a vending machine for private school, travel teams, and every shiny opportunity that let him post about his champions, I signed checks because I wanted the kids to have chances I did not. And because I believed he would eventually learn to be grateful instead of grabby. I did not tell him that in the weeks before that call. I had already been thinking about boundaries, because something in me had shifted from trying to change his tone to simply removing the microphone, and I had reread the trust language, talked with the attorney who drafted it, and learned things I had skimmed over when Dad died, like how discretion really means discretion when you have documented reasons and follow the process, and how a trustee is not a piñata for the loudest relative but a fiduciary with a duty to the actual purpose, and the actual purpose was never keep Mark comfortable so he can call himself a winner at Easter. You will ask why I said, okay, instead of unleashing years of swallowed pushback, and the answer is boring and powerful at the same time, because arguing with him has always been a stage where he wins by volume. And because I had finally realized that the most honest reply was not a speech but a decision, and decisions do not need applause to be real. I texted Mom that night and told her I loved her and would see her soon, and I did not explain the call because she already lives in the tension between her children and tries to smooth it with casseroles and prayers, and I chose not to hand her one more thing to carry. I just said I had plans for Easter and hoped the day would be peaceful, and she sent back a heart, which I read as relief and also as a little ache, because she knows more than she says. Then I opened the folder on my laptop with the trust documents Dad signed and the notes from the attorney I had quietly consulted, and I read the same paragraph 3 times until the words stopped blurring, and I understood, bone deep, that I did not have to join a dinner to get the last word. I only had to do my job, and do it completely. So I went to bed with my phone on silent, and if you are wondering whether I cried or raged or punched a pillow, I did none of that, because somewhere between his winners only line and my okay, my feelings had stopped being the point, and the point had become the follow-through. By the time Easter rolled around, Mark thought the story ended with me staying home while he toasted himself, which is exactly what I wanted him to think, because the real ending was already in motion, and there was no version where he saw it coming. If you want the honest version instead of the edited family story that gets told at birthdays and politely nodded over, then here it is in the shape it actually lived in my head, which is a string of moments that were never dramatic enough to justify a scene, but were steady enough to grind a groove, because my brother did not become the kind of man who says winners only in one afternoon. He trained for it for years with these small humiliations he tossed like breadcrumbs and expected me to follow while thanking him for the snack, and I did follow, because I thought that was what a good sister does when a parent tells her to be patient with a son who has a big personality and a fragile core. And I kept being patient right up until patience turned into permission, and he started mistaking my silence for agreement. When we were younger and I was the one who kept spreadsheets for Dad during tax season while my brother bounced between jobs with titles that sounded important and paychecks that needed a little help, the family joke was that I was reliable and he was vision, which meant I did dishes while he made big promises and then turned those promises into reasons I should pick up the slack. And if this sounds familiar to you, it is because every family has a person like him and a person like me, and the world cheers for the former while thanking the latter privately, then forgetting the thanks the second a new crisis arrives, and believe me, the crises arrived on schedule. He called me for rides to the dealership when he leased something he could not afford. He called me to talk to the bank when overdraft charges ate a hole in his account. He called me when his son needed an evaluation for a learning plan at school and his wife was overwhelmed, and he said I was good at forms, which is true and also not the compliment he thought it was. And through all of this, the trust Dad set up for the grandkids became the cushion under every fall, which might have been fine if it kept them safe, but over time it turned into an expectation that any desire with a nice label attached to it counted as need, so every summer camp had to be a lead, every team had to travel, every tutor had to be the one with a waiting list. Because the money was there, and why not use it if it made the family look like winners? I am not proud of how long I co-signed that story, but I am not ashamed either, because I am human and I love those kids, and I wanted them to have soft landings where I had hard ones. And I wanted Dad's voice to carry past his funeral in a way that made the family better, not louder, so I signed distribution requests even when the language felt slippery, and I told myself that Mark would grow into gratitude once the noise settled. Except the noise never settled, it just found more speakers. And the day he called to disinvite me from Easter, he unknowingly tested the one boundary I had been drawing in pencil for years, which is that I will not keep financing a narrative where my worth is reduced to whether I am useful. People will say this next part is harsh, and I can live with that, because the alternative is to keep living as the safety net that gets spit on between catches. So after that call, I sat down with the attorney who drafted the trust, a woman named Karen who has the kind of clear mind that levels you, and I told her I needed to revisit the purpose language without the guilt goggles I have been wearing since the day Dad signed, and she walked me through the clauses I skimmed when my eyes were red and my hands were shaking, and we read, slowly, that distributions were at trustee discretion for educational support when the funds supported effort, character, and the absence of manipulative conduct by parents, and that trustees could suspend or terminate distributions to any beneficiary if a parent used the funds to create dependency, status competition, or abuse in the family. And we did not have to play cute with what abuse meant in this context, because Dad had defined it exactly for this reason, and I felt my spine come back to me as we mapped what documentation would look like. I gathered emails where Mark bragged about leveraging Grandpa's money to get a better coach. I pulled text threads where he threatened to go public with family business if I delayed a request. I collected notes from school where funds were deployed not for need but for optics, and I wrote my own statement about the pattern of humiliation and pressure that accompanied every check. A pattern Dad anticipated when he wrote the phrase about manipulative conduct, which, reading it now, feels like he knew exactly which kid would try to turn a gift into a weapon, and which kid would have to take the weapon away while everyone complained about the noise. Before you decide I was aiming at the children, hear this part closely, because it kept me up at night and it deserves to be spoken without spin, which is that I am not cutting those kids off from education. I am cutting their parents off from siphoning family legacy into trophies that spell out superiority, and I put in writing, with Karen's help, a pathway for each child to petition directly at certain ages for support tied to their own plans, with verified effort, matched contributions, and no parental interference, and I set aside funds for need-based scholarships at their public schools in the meantime, so no one's life blows up because their father wanted to peacock, and if that sounds like a workaround, it is. Because I am not trying to burn the field, I am trying to stop one man from turning the field into a stage. When I signed the temporary suspension of distributions pending review, a quiet notice went to Mark's accountant and a formal letter went to his house with a date for a trustee meeting he was invited to attend. And I knew he would not read the letter until a bill bounced and someone called him, which is exactly what happened, because predictability is his brand. And when the school portal flagged an unpaid tuition installment that he assumed would be covered automatically, his phone exploded. And then mine did, and I let it ring, because I remembered his line about winners only and decided to show him what winning without volume looks like. By the end of that week, the paper trail was neat, the process was clean, the door for the kids was protected, and the door for their father was closing. And the only thing left to decide was whether I would give him a heads up out of decency or let the system speak first, and I chose the latter, because decency without accountability is just lubricant for more of the same. And I was done being the oil in an engine he kept flooring. The letter with the suspension reached his mailbox on a Friday, the exact day the school's payment system sent an automated reminder, and his wife posted a little victory graphic about raising champions, and I am not proud that I smiled, but I did. Because sometimes the timing writes itself, and I knew, with absolute certainty, that the next time I would hear his voice would not be on the phone, it would be on my porch, and he would not be there to talk. By the time Monday morning rolled around, I had already rehearsed in my mind how the next steps needed to unfold, not because I was trying to savor the drama, but because I knew that the only way to do this and have it stick was to operate with a precision that left no cracks for him to wedge open later. No clauses he could twist, no emotional appeal he could manipulate in front of the rest of the family. And that meant making every move under the cover of normalcy until the paperwork was complete, the signatures were locked, and the financial mechanisms that had been his safety net for years were completely dismantled from the inside. I understood that trust law, especially in the way our father's attorney had designed it, wasn't something you could navigate with half measures, and I also knew that if I tipped my hand too soon, Mark would throw every ounce of his energy into turning the rest of the family against me, painting himself as the victim of an unreasonable sister who had some personal grudge. So I leaned on the one advantage I had always had over him, patience, and the ability to make a plan without announcing it to the room. I spent hours with Karen going line by line through the trust agreement, making sure the language we used in every action memo and trustee record was not only airtight, but written in such a way that even if he tried to take it to another attorney, they'd have to admit there was nothing improper in what had been done. She explained that the key was to base every decision on documented history rather than emotion, which was almost amusing considering how deeply personal this was for me. But I took her advice to heart and started building a portfolio of exactly why the suspension and termination clauses applied. Every email where he made demands instead of requests, every message that framed the trust as his personal bank, every instance where funds had been used to elevate status instead of meeting genuine educational needs. They all went into a folder that was meticulously labeled and cross-referenced, because I wasn't just ending the trust payments, I was making sure that no matter how loud he got, the paper trail was louder. While this was happening, I made sure my normal communication with the rest of the family looked exactly the same as it always did. I called my mother about her doctor's appointment, I texted my niece about her school play, I even liked one of Mark's wife's social media posts so nothing looked unusual from the outside. The truth was, I didn't want the kids caught in the crossfire of his reaction before the changes were final, and I also didn't want to give him the satisfaction of sensing that I was moving against him. Every interaction was calculated to buy more time, because time, in situations like this, is the weapon no one sees until it's too late. The actual mechanics of pulling the trigger on the trust were almost anticlimactic compared to the emotional weight of the decision. There wasn't a dramatic moment where I stormed into an office and slammed a pen on the table. Instead, there was a series of quiet, deliberate actions that closed doors one after another. I signed the suspension notice for all distributions linked to his branch of the family. I reallocated certain funds to a reserve account that could only be accessed for direct educational expenses filed by the beneficiaries themselves once they reached a specific age. And I updated the trust bylaws to require dual trustee approval for any future reinstatement, knowing full well that the co-trustee I brought in to replace our late father's role was someone with a backbone strong enough to withstand Mark's pressure. Every one of these actions was done with the knowledge that when he finally discovered what had happened, he wouldn't be able to reverse it without a legal battle he was unprepared to fight, both financially and in terms of evidence. That was the quiet beauty of the process. It wasn't vengeful in the traditional sense. It was simply taking the power he had misused and reassigning it in a way that served the original intent rather than his ego. But I would be lying if I said there wasn't a certain satisfaction in knowing he would feel the absence of that money in very real, very inconvenient ways. I made the final signatures midweek, and Karen confirmed that the updated trust documents had been filed and certified. She told me, in her blunt but not unkind way, that if he wanted to challenge it, he'd be walking into a fight he couldn't win, because there was too much documented evidence against him and too many clear instances of misuse. That was when it really sank in for me. This wasn't just about one petty insult over Easter dinner, it was about years of entitlement, years of him assuming there would never be a consequence, because I had never enforced one. And now there was, and it was irreversible. I didn't tell anyone outside of Karen and the new co-trustee. I didn't need to. I knew how the news would reach him, not through me, but through the sudden absence of what he had taken for granted. The first missed payment would make him furious, the second would make him panic, and by the third, he'd realize that this wasn't a clerical error or a temporary delay. It was a deliberate and permanent change to the landscape of his life. And that was when I expected him to show up in person, because Mark has never been able to handle loss quietly, especially when the loss challenges the image he's been selling to the world. I went to bed that night without any sense of guilt or hesitation, because I had finally done something I should have done years earlier, not out of spite, but out of self-respect. He thought that the call about winners only would be a final jab in a fight he believed he'd already won. What he didn't understand was that it was just the opening move of the one I had been preparing for all along. And now, the move was complete. All that was left was for him to find out just how thoroughly I had taken away the thing he thought he owned. He came the way I knew he would come, not with a measured call or a request to talk like adults, but with that pounding urgency that always meant he wanted the whole neighborhood to hear his version first. And I let him knock and ring and breathe into the doorbell camera, while I stood there on the other side of the door taking the slowest breath I have taken in a long time, because I had promised myself that if he wanted a show he would give it alone, and if he wanted a conversation he would have to step into one that had rules. And while he was busy shouting my name, the alerts from the trust's payment portal were lighting my phone with the exact timestamps that would go into the record, which might sound cold to you. But when you have spent years being told that your feelings are dramatic and his behavior is normal, you learn to love a timestamp the way some people love a hug. He started with the greatest hits, the lines he believes make him sound responsible and wronged at the same time, telling me I had embarrassed his family and jeopardized his children's future, and that he had already spoken to the school and the coach and the bank and they all agreed I was out of line. And when I still did not open the door, he moved to the threats he thinks are persuasion, saying he would call mom right now, saying he would get a lawyer, saying the kids would hate me when they learned what I had done, and I stood there listening to that old music and realized the part that used to hurt was gone, replaced by something steadier, which was the understanding that he was not actually talking to me. He was talking to the source that fed his story, and the source had gone dry, and he was scared. I told him through the intercom that I would speak to him if he could be calm, and for a second he tried on a calm voice the way a kid tries on his father's suit, stiff and ill-fitting, asking me to open the door and clear up the confusion. And I said there was no confusion, and that he had received a letter outlining the reasons for the suspension and the path for review. And I also said what I should have said years ago, which is that the trust was never meant to inflate a parent's image and that I would not sign off on payments that were more about winning than learning, and he lost the performative calm so fast it was almost impressive, launching into a rant about how I had always been jealous and small, and that this was me finally getting my moment. And I let him say it because the camera was recording and because sometimes the most satisfying thing is to let a person outline their own pattern with their own words. When he tried to shove the door, the deadbolt did its job and the recording captured the thud, and I told him that if he kept it up I would have to call someone, not because I was afraid of him, which I am not, but because it would help me keep the process clean. And he stepped back and started begging in that sideways way where the begging is wrapped in blame, telling me the kids had games and deadlines and that I had timed this to humiliate them, which is the part that got me angry enough to speak harder than I planned, because he is the one who tied their calendars to a pipeline of money he did not control, and he is the one who used their activities to preen, and if those activities now had to be paid for like every other parent pays for things, that is not humiliation, that is adulthood. I told him that the trust had been restructured to allow the kids to apply directly when they were old enough, with their own plans and their own contributions and documentation that prioritized effort over optics. And he did not like that at all because it removed him from the center, so he spat out a line about how I would be sorry when they missed out on something big, and I said, very plainly, that missing out on unnecessary status purchases is not a tragedy. And that his panic was not about their loss, it was about his, and then I did the thing that shifted the ground under his feet, which was to inform him that his messages and his behavior that day were now part of the trustee file under the clause about manipulative conduct. And that because of what he had said and done on my porch, the recommendation to move from suspension to termination for his branch would be entered by close of business, and that if he wanted to stop digging the hole he might want to stop yelling into the shovel. He called me a few names that will never appear in a family scrapbook, and then he tried the soft route again, asking me to think about our father and what he would want, and I said I was, because our father put the discretion language in for exactly this reason. And I reminded him that Dad had told both of us, separately and more than once, that money should never be used to turn relatives into audience, and he could not argue that point without exposing himself, so he switched tack to telling me he would fix this with a lawyer who would tear through my little paperwork tower, and I told him that he was free to try, but that I had already brought in a co-trustee with a spine and a reputation for not bending, and that any lawyer worth the retainer would advise him to stop making himself look worse. When he finally ran out of air and pride at the same time, he did what he always does, which is to make a dramatic exit and promise vengeance, stomping down the steps and shouting that the kids would not forget this and neither would he. And I stood behind the door with my hands steady and my voice steady and the little light on the camera steady, and I sent the clips and a short narrative to Karen while he was still reversing out of the driveway, and she replied with a single line that said we had everything we needed to move to termination and that she would file the notice immediately. So the revenge for that episode was not a slap or a scream or a public scene I would regret later. It was a quiet escalation that he triggered with his own behavior, a clean conversion of his threats into the exact proof the trust required. And as the email sent and the file updated and the legal wheels turned, I felt the smallest, sharpest click of a lock engaging, because the door he believed he could kick open had just become a wall, and he did not know yet that on the other side of that wall I had already put the last piece in place. The day after he tore a hole in the afternoon on my porch, the filings went through exactly the way Karen said they would, which meant that the suspension formally converted to termination for his branch and the new structure for the kids' access came online. And while that sounds like a pile of legal words, what it meant in real life was simple and final, because the stream of money he had treated like household plumbing was capped, the valve replaced, and any future flow would go directly to institutions on behalf of the actual students after they made their own case and backed it with their own effort, with no room for a parent to slap their name on the invoice and call it leadership, and if he wanted to fight that, he would have to fight it on paper against the words our father chose when he was clear-eyed and still in charge, which is a fight he could not win without admitting to the very behavior he has been performing in public for years while insisting it was love. I wrote one email to the family, short for once but not vague, where I explained that the trust had been misused in ways the documents anticipated and prohibited, that a review had been conducted with evidence, that distributions for his branch were terminated pursuant to the clause about manipulative conduct, and that the grandchildren would have a path to request funding directly when they were old enough to manage responsibility without parental pressure. And I closed by saying that any concerns should be addressed to the trustees through council rather than through group texts or surprise visits, and I hit send knowing it would land like a plate smashing in a kitchen where someone was already yelling, but also knowing that I had finally stopped pretending you can keep everybody happy by standing in the middle and absorbing the blows. He did exactly what we knew he would do, which was to hire the loudest attorney he could afford for a very short time, and there was a burst of letters full of adjectives and empty of facts. And then there was a quieter letter from a different attorney telling him that litigation would require disclosures he did not want to make and depositions he could not control, and, while I did not see that second letter, I could hear it in the way his threats slowed down and his posts tilted toward nostalgia, as if he could rewind the narrative to before Easter and sell a version of events where I had overreacted to a joke, and if that helped him sleep, I was not going to argue with it. Because I had no interest in fixing the story he tells strangers when my job was to fix the flow of funds he thought he owned. People ask whether I feel bad for the kids, and the answer is layered in a way that makes some listeners uncomfortable, because I feel heavy about the disruption in their schedules and the confusion they did not cause. But I do not feel guilty for refusing to bankroll a performance that was hurting them more than it helped them, and I tried to put a little light on the path forward by sending each of them a plain letter they will open when they reach the age we set. A letter that explains how to apply for support tied to plans they actually want, not plans chosen for photos or bragging rights, and that letter includes a list of things our father believed money should do, like buy time to study, buy calm in a storm, and buy a door out of a corner. And none of those things require a parent to pound on a sister's door and call her names, so if any part of them has been absorbing the lie that what happened was my cruelty, I want them to have in writing that this was an attempt to give them ownership over their own lives. My mother called me the night after the email went out, and there was that pause where you can hear a parent looking for language that will keep two children from tearing up what is left of the table. And I told her the same thing I have told myself since the trust papers first landed in my lap years ago, which is that stewardship is not about being liked, it is about doing the right thing when no one claps. And she exhaled in a way that told me she had been waiting to hear me say something, without apologizing for it, and she said she loved me and she loved him, and that she did not know how to make him stop, and I said she did not have to, because for once the consequence did not require an apology tour or a family summit. It required exactly nothing from her, which might be the first gift I have ever given her that did not come wrapped in stress. In the weeks that followed, he tried to reroute his anger into a campaign that leaned on every relative who thinks conflict is worse than harm, and some of them called me with that pleading tone that always worked on me before, asking if there was any way to make a compromise that would save face, and I told them the truth they had never heard from me in such simple words, which is that boundaries are not a negotiation. And this one lives in a document our father signed to prevent this exact whether, and if they wanted peace they could have it by refusing to be part of the chorus that keeps handing him a microphone every time he raises his voice, and a few of them got quiet in a new way that sounded like relief rather than fear. And that was the first time I understood that I had not only protected the kid's future from his performance, I had also protected the rest of us from a very old cycle. I will not pretend there were no second thoughts, because I am still the person who cleans up after parties and notices when someone is standing alone at the edge of the room. And there were nights where the house was too quiet, and I wondered if I could have found a path that taught him a lesson without burning the bridge. But then I would think about that call where he said winners only and about the look on his face in every memory where I accepted the insult and kept carrying the bags, and I would remember that there is a difference between a bridge and a leash, and I had cut the leash, which meant that if a bridge was ever going to be built, it could only be built by two people coming toward the same spot from opposite sides, not by one person dragging the other and calling it family. He has not spoken to me since the day he promised to fix it, and perhaps there will come a time when he tries to rebuild something that looks like trust, but behaves like control, and perhaps there will not, and I can live with either outcome. Because the move that mattered has already landed and locked, and the echo of it has made the house feel steadier in ways that are hard to explain unless you have spent years living on shifting ground, and if I ever doubt the choice, I can open the folder with the filings and see the clean lines and the consistent dates and the unmistakable shape of a plan that finally matched the truth I had been living, which is that I did not need a seat at his table to win. I needed to stop pretending his table decided the score. So this is the part where I am supposed to say that I forgive him and that we are all learning, or maybe the part where I declare victory and strut, but neither of those are quite right for where I am standing. Because what I feel most is a quiet I earned and a boundary that holds, and a kind of satisfaction that is not loud but is steady. And if you are listening for one last twist, then here it is, small and sharp. Which is that I did not actually end anything for his kids. I ended the story. He kept telling about what makes someone a winner, and if they want to write a better one, a cleaner one, a freer one, the door is open on their side, and the map is simple, and the person who tried to turn family into audience no longer runs the show. Which might be the only ending that ever mattered.